transmuting emotions?
Just don't have them. It's easier. No emotions. There.
Thank you.
Any questions? So of course that's what we're always trying to do, is just the opposite of transmuting. We're trying to either stop the emotion, literally try to stop it. We're trying to distract ourselves from it by finding something else to do to stop feeling that way. Or we might be trying to stop the emotion by blaming somebody else for why we're having the emotion. Or we might be going the other way and blaming ourselves. Or a little story about, I gotta stop feeling that way. Why am I feeling like this? As soon as any why question is circular, because you're going to get a because. Because you're going to get a because, and it's going to be a little bit okay, but not really satisfactory. It's just another circle, another circle, another circle. It's just around and around and around. So the idea of transmuting, excuse me, I have a tickle in my throat. Has anyone looked up that word? Anybody got a phone? I looked up transmuting. Technology. I don't know if I'd do it, but I'd do without it. See if there's a really good talk on that.
Transmute.
Change in form, nature, or substance.
Yeah, so transform. Okay, so trans over form. Transform. Transmute. Transmute sounds a little bit more esoteric, transform. Less Western and more mystical.
There's another one. To change or alter in form, appearance, or nature, and especially to a higher form.
Mm-hmm. So it's been said that you can, in the Buddhist teachings, that you can transform emotions into compassion, into serving others instead of just your own little property, your own little antagonism inside. I don't like it, it's not good, it shouldn't be this way, well, why am I doing this? Why do I feel this way? And so on. And so the beginning of that seems to be is to stop doing anything with it. And it's very difficult to not do something with it. And just as soon as you have any kind of a feeling that's triggered by anything from somebody cutting you off in traffic to someone being rude to you for no apparent reason or for apparent reason, either way, is that emotions arise, and what we conventionally do is we blame this way or blame that way, or we explain, or we try to do something with it. And so the transmutation, transformation seems to be necessary to look deeply into the emotion, and you can't look into it if you're covering it up with blaming, and you're covering it up with explaining. You're covering it up with anything. Well, the reason I'm feeling this way is because of that. That's a misunderstanding. Although it could have some relative truth to it. I mean, you could have people who would agree with you, that's why. Which is why we often have conversations, because we want agreement. Or else we want somebody to disagree so we can show them how they're wrong. That's another reason for conversations. Conversations are very circular. Doesn't mean they're not good, but it does mean they're bad. So the transmutation or transformation seems to come from being able to, I say able, that ability is probably, I'm not saying you can't, but probably not going to arise unless you spent quite a bit of time looking very, very closely, deeply, precisely into whatever's arising in the mind. Unless you've actually watched something arise out of nowhere, nothingness, and come up as a manifestation of a feeling, a thought, an idea, a memory, anything coming out of nowhere or an apparent nowhere into an apparent somewhere, your mind, unless you've looked at that without evaluation, without accepting it, without rejecting it, and without turning away, ignoring, and distracting yourself. Unless you practice that, you will be captured by the extra material that comes up with the emotion, which is usually hope, fear, something else that's coming up along with it, that we just kind of bail out of the emotion into that, whatever that is, into that other angle, because we feel like we can make some progress. In our tradition, this is called spiritual materialism. Trying to use spiritual techniques to accomplish something. You might say, you could say, and I'm about to say, well, enough said. What was I going to say? So something came up, and it was an emotion, and we were trying to figure out what we should do with that. So the interesting thing is, if you do nothing with it, if you keep it in its raw form, that it will either just go away, or if it stays up and needs to be, you could say, converted or transformed, then that transformation, you won't get in the way of that transformation. Transformation is not something you do, it's something you are. So not something you do, it's something you are, that transformation. And the way in which you, the fancy word you hear from in other lineages or other spiritual traditions is participation mystique. It's like a participation that's not about two things. It's a participation that is complete involvement, complete non-separation from whatever is occurring. So quite often our ego mind feels like we're being swamped by our feelings, our emotions, our antagonisms, our internal warfare, and we might have the experience of being overwhelmed by that. So I don't know if it can be done without a lot of exercising that area of the mind that is fairly formless. If you're working in the area of mind that is full of forms, called the intellect, thinking process, analyzing, subtracting, dividing, sorting out, using categories and so on, the mind of an attorney or the mind of a scientist, not wrong. We need those. We wouldn't have our Prius if it weren't for those guys. I know how to make a Prius. Do you guys? I can make one of those. They are complicated. We saw, what do they call that when they bisect? Was that a cross section of a Prius? We went to a place down in Indiana where they had sliced one across like this and opened it up, and my goodness, there's all kinds of things in there. Rabbits, alligators. No, they've got all kinds of various little devices that, and I've worked in cars before, back in the early part of the last century when they invented them. And there was a carburetor, gas tank, spark plugs. So it was either electrical or mechanical. Or yeah, it was either electrical or fuel. One of those two things was wrong. Now it's, who knows what that is. That cars actually think. I think they think. So the idea is to allow, if you can, and this is just a way of talking about it, it's not really not allowing so much as it's not obstructing it, allow the emotion to, as it's congealing, as it's coming together, as it's starting to feel like it's going to overwhelm you, or to be too much, or you feel like a little bit of a low level of panic starting to happen, do nothing. Don't add to the panic. Don't subtract from the panic. It's almost like you have a willingness to experience whatever arises. It's almost like you have a kind of openness that you've been reconditioning yourself to not go into constant control over everything. And so you can actually, simple word, witness what's arising. Witness how that how that comes up, and see deeply into what that emotion is, because each emotion, whether it's hope and fear or anger or jealousy and all the other variables that could be entered in there, different words for describing those dynamics. Pardon me. It seems that those need to be seen deeply without some kind of a person behind it who wants things to be different than they are, without some kind of a demand on anything. If there's some kind of demand, we automatically we're back to primitive kind of relations, warfare. Question?
On Bruce's talk, he was talking about joy and bliss and happiness, and the way he was presenting it, it sounded like you would never really have any difficult emotions. And some of the questions came around that, and he talked about afflicted emotions and just emotions. As it regards anger, for example, I think that. So, how in the midst of it, how does self-serving anger transform into a selfless activity that still feels aggressive?
Okay, so one of the ways it's been described is we're not trying to get rid of anger. We're not trying to get rid of any particular emotion. One of the ways that's been described is to have as anger without hatred. So a little bit, we're human beings, we're going to have some discontent, there's going to be some anger, but the anger, there's no kind of axe to grind behind it, no kind of, nothing extra, there's just the anger. And if one is concerned about their self-image, about their ego, their self-centeredness, or about how they appear to others, then there's going to be some extra stuff thrown in there. And I think it's the extra stuff that happens. The simple emotions and so on can come and go. And the way I often say it, I think I was saying it earlier today, that you can experience any kind of emotion coming and going. It's not about getting rid of anything. What it is about is, according to these teachings, is seeing that there is no solid being who's experiencing these. So there's no person who is feeling that. What we do is we have a feeling and we impute someone who's having this. And we'll even say it to validate that whole thing by saying, why am I feeling like this? Well, there isn't anyone. So if you say, why am I, you're positing some kind of identity that is experiencing something that's separate that they don't deserve or shouldn't have. Whereas someone who is completely sane, to use a modern word, they're not for or against anything, particularly. When I say particularly, you notice I use all the syllables. I don't say particularly. You notice that?
That's impressive.
Tell me, it's taken a lot of work to do that. I've had to be critical of a lot of news reporters to be able to get to the point where I don't do what they do. You guys hear me? Jasmine.
During our interview, you said something to me that was extremely helpful, and I'm wondering if you could share that with everybody and elaborate on it.
I can't remember what it was.
I'm telling you.
I knew that was coming. Yes.
You said I was talking about a negative emotion that I was experiencing.
Yes.
It. And one of the things you said that was so helpful was don't give it a name.
Mm-hmm.
Because once you give it a name, you're adding. And I never thought of the fact of calling emotion, calling what you're feeling anger, and then you immediately make it into just that, and you don't really examine it.
You don't.
So could you sort of
So
direct
the
everybody?
thing
it
that
was so helpful.
Oh, good. So the thing that I often say, not usually, but often say about that is that if you need to call it something, then make up a name and change the name every time you have that emotion. Call it caramel apples. They're nice. Call it something else. It doesn't have to be something oddball or something like that. It could be. You could call it a blue river. You know, I mean, actually go in and with some seriousness, actually, I mean, it's your mind. as it's your mind. So whatever's arising in it, you can do just about anything you want with it. You don't have to just be at war with whatever's arising. You also don't have to accept what's arising. Either way, accepting is passion, rejecting is aggression, and shutting off or turning away or distracting yourself is ignorance. So the important thing to, if you want to transmute these, first you're going to have to get your hands dirty. So you're going to have to actually be in that texture, and that does not feel comfortable to the self-centered mind. The downside is it doesn't feel comfortable to the ego mind. The upside of it is that's how it will feel to begin to transcend the separate self or the ego mind. You will have to get your hands dirty. You'll have to get into the texture of that, and that seems to be how to transform emotions. But using what you seem to get value out of is so that you can actually do that. You might have to call it something else. You don't have to be silly about it, but you could. Or not call it anything. Just notice the texture of it. If you can see the texture of something, if you can feel, anytime there's texture, there's always space. You can't have texture without space. If you have something that has no texture, then that's linoleum. Make sense? As opposed to shag carpet. So the carpeting has all kinds of, but the linoleum that's the nature of ignorance. That's how the emotion will appear. It'll appear like brick. And it'll feel terrible. It'll feel heavy. It'll feel difficult. It'll feel cold. It'll feel whatever it feels. It might have some kind of a texture, but there's no space there. It's just like sandpaper. Sandpaper has texture too, but you've got to stop fighting with it and go down into the actual points that form the abrasiveness of it. Like, here are my fingernails. That's how that sound will be a feeling sound. So you have to go in and you have to actually make all of that your own. And don't go to war with yourself anymore. If you want to, as has been said way before I got here, you can't have peace out here unless you have peace here. If you've got as the poet Kabir said, if you with a loaded gun in here, how can you have God? You can't have ultimate happiness, realization, understanding, peace in the world if you're always armed and ready to be triggered and go into combat with somebody. But if the war is no longer happening here, then there's no warrior. I'm not saying the fancy kind of a warrior. I'm talking about the person who actually fights. If that's been somehow seen through or resolved, or seen that it's unreal, or seen that it's just a stage play, then it's not that you can't be triggered, but there's no solid being there who's been triggered, so therefore it doesn't last very long. It may show up, you may feel irritated with something, but because you're there and you're present, you don't mind being irritated. It doesn't last. It can't last. Unless you're a really bad person. And then you're screwed. So of course, it's always about the awareness. It's always about awareness, not what arises in the awareness. It's always about the sky, not about the clouds. But in order for it to be about the sky, you have to look at the clouds. And you have to not accept them, not reject them, not look away. And at some point, the transcendence part is not no clouds. It's seeing that the clouds in the sky are not separate anymore. That nothing is separate from anything else. Even though it shows up as totally different or opposite, or shows up alive, it shows up not alive, it shows up happy, it shows up sad. It's like my teacher, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche said, happy and sad, good and bad, happy and sad, all thoughts vanish into emptiness, like the imprint of a bird in the sky. I think he said that in the Sadhana of Mahamudra. Further questions?
Do you find it helpful to inquire into what might be triggering certain emotions if they're...
Yeah, a little bit. I think as long as you don't do it as some kind of an agenda that you always have to do, to find, just look at the trigger a little bit, but make sure that you realize this is a trigger, this is not the emotion itself. Because if you get it confused, you'll travel right up the trigger to blaming. Who pulled that trigger? Well, if they hadn't done this, I wouldn't feel this way. If my mother hadn't treated me this way, I wouldn't have this problem. So it goes every direction. It's tiring to blame. Even if somebody, that's the amazing thing about it, even though somebody did cause you some difficulty. I had a stepfather who was very difficult with me as a little person. But if I look at it, I say he couldn't help but do it. I mean, he was the way he was raised, the way he was treated, what he went through in his life. He couldn't be some other person. He had to function the way he was functioning. He didn't have the good fortune to run into someone who could teach him about how his consciousness worked. So therefore he believed his thoughts, and he just kept drinking beer. And he just kept living, and he kept, making life difficult for a small person, which is very confusing. On the other hand, I could be grateful to him, even though it was difficult. I can be grateful to that because I probably would not be on this path without that kind of situation. So everything's dependently arisen. You can't find first cause for anything. It's actually a good discovery. It's just a great discovery, because that way no philosophy works. Nothing works because you can't track it down. Because actually, as you probably all know, and I was telling you that this whole thing was started 15 billion years ago by aliens from the Pleiades. You knew that? Or maybe not. Maybe it was, what was that other one? Andromeda? Was that the one that got mixed up with a star? I thought it was a star, but it was actually a galaxy. Yeah. We just need to stick to our own solar system. Those are easy. I know all 6 of them. Further questions? Gary?
Part of the work we're doing in here, looking at the wall, is
Yes.
identifying when things come up, but it's lightning fast. Somebody tells you a joke and you're laughing before you know it.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you're angry, the same, boom, like that. Can you talk about the difference there between the two? Maybe it's the exact same thing, how it operates.
Pretty similar.
Yeah.
It's just it just occurs, and the occurrence is fine. It's the extra, it's the adding on that we do. That shouldn't happen, or that should happen, or the very simple one that people think is benign and is not benign at all. It's the tiny little spark. It's called "There I go again."
Say that again.
There I go again. If you're feeling something has happened, or you're out in post-meditation in your everyday life and somebody does something or says something, or you're in an interaction with another person in some way, and then you'll feel some kind of negative, and then there I go again. I can't seem to stop that or control that. That's extra, and that actually covers up the very texture that you need to be, transforming. You need to see it. It's difficult to be a person. Have you noticed? You're like, that's new. It's difficult. Rarely are people working with their minds in this particular way. Usually it's through some kind of more psychological, not that we don't need some of that too, but it's more through some kind of a controlling, rather than a seeing and awareness situation. It's through some kind of a technique to control. I mean, everything from, and I haven't studied every psychology, but I certainly have, I'm very nosy about everything. So I spent years studying I'm okay, you're okay. You've probably all heard of that transactional analysis. And then there was a primal screen. I was going to lose my voice doing that. Listening to Yoko Ono and John Lennon. So I worked on that for a while. Before I met my teacher. And then he said, shh, shut up. So, all kinds of ways, but this particular way, and Buddhism is taught a little bit differently with different teachers, a different kind of understanding. No one's wrong, so I don't mean that. I'm just saying that this is a very interesting way to sit down and use these teachings that come from 2,500 years ago, and also all the lineage holders down through the centuries have different ideas about how that works, including Vasubandhu in the 3rd century of the Common Era. To actually look at, just let it be what it is. I don't know, it's not even a letting. It's even the word letting is extra. It's just, you sit down, hold still, and you don't agree, passion. You don't object, aggression, and you don't turn away, distract the three poisons: passion, aggression, ignorance. And to do that, eventually, things start to become more obvious. And one of the things that becomes obvious is there's no solid being here. There's a body, of course. There's form, feeling, perception, concept, consciousness. There's the sense fields, the sense objects, the sense consciousnesses, the organs that we hear through. There's that, but they don't make up a solid person. Thought I'd let you in on that. It sure seems like it, though, doesn't it? I mean, if someone attacks you, or if someone compliments you, you know, if someone says, "Oh my gosh, Gary, you're one of the most wonderful people I've ever met."
My beard.
Yeah, I think it's the beard.
It's got it.
So we feel, even making fun, we feel a little bit of, just like if I turn to, who could I pick on? Let's see, I don't want to, I'm going to pick on you. And I come at you, and I'm not going to do it, but if I come at you and just, even if I make it up and I criticize you, and I just pick out something about you and say something bad, evil, harmful, or critical of you, even if I'm pretending, you'll feel it. You know, I sometimes wonder how actors can even do that kind of work. Cause you can't just act and keep your emotions out of it. What do they call it? Method acting, something like that. But I don't know how that's done. So we're very, very sensitive even to pretend stuff. You know, we react to it. So what do? In this tradition, on this path, we take this untrained mind and we bring it down to a situation where we sit down, hold still, not worshiping anybody. We're just sitting down, holding still, and we're watching the way the mind works, hour after hour after hour. It takes a lot of time. We've been around here forever. I don't believe in past lives. I don't disbelieve in past lives. But something's been going on for way longer than this lifetime. And here we are again. And all of the things that have been unexamined from the 14th century are showing up right here. Unless they're not triggered, sometimes we can get away with it. If there's no war going on, if our relationship karma is pretty good, you get a relationship where the person is, a really nice person. Even that way it gives us a chance to be a rat. That person's karma is to take care of a rat. So. So it's always about awareness, coming back to square one. Transforming emotions is, you have to be aware of the emotion, and you can't be aware of the emotion if you're rejecting it, or if you're accepting it by saying, well, it's because of this. As soon as you say it's because of this, as soon as you say, there I go, or here it comes again, or I don't deserve this, anything like that, you've actually covered up the very transformation, transmutation that is possible to actually be a completely present human being living here now in this particular place and time, this very moment. There isn't anything but this moment. If you think there is, you'll suffer, and you'll probably cause others to suffer through. Just being around them. Further questions? Oh, you're rubbing your forehead. Just go down.
You said, I don't remember exactly what you said, but the negative self-talk around the emotion. But if the biggest poison is ignorance, that self-talk could be happening under the surface, so you don't even see it.
Yes.
So if we're conditioned to ignore that, how can they be muted if we don't even know how we're hooked?
Yes, repetition. This is why anybody here who's a close student of mine, you know how much I badger you about sitting. It's the only thing I tell you to do, I think, other than study if you can, but you're not required to watch my talks. It's just if you don't watch them, I'll get a little upset. I'll blame you. But I say, go sit down, train your mind. Sit down, hold still. You don't have to be a Buddhist. Nobody's requiring you to receive vows, or that's your business. If you want to do that, I'll help you. If you just want to study your mind and see how your mind works. A good example is Fleeta. She's not here now, but I've been talking to her for, I don't know, 12 years, something like that. She has no intention of joining, sewing a rock suit. And she doesn't need to. But she's very, very sincere about trying to find out fundamentally what this being a living being is about for herself. She still has some work to do, and she knows it. So she's practicing, and so it's about that. I think it's the insistence, that you're going to do this. You're no longer going to necessarily look for some kind of credential that you're getting somewhere. If there's still some kind of subtle reaching out for something, trying to get a credential, trying to see if you're getting somewhere, this is called the mundane path. This works pretty well if you're working on a PhD, or if you're working on something that has a material path to it, of acquiring, getting. But the spiritual path could be said to be, it's the opposite way. You start to lose. You lose your credentials, you lose your reference points, you lose your identity, and eventually you lose your life. But you're still alive. You're still alive. There's just no solid being anymore. So there's still some animation going on, but there's no solid being, and so therefore there's no suffering that belongs to anyone. I'm not saying there's not difficulty here, but it doesn't happen to a person anymore. So don't give up. Just keep going. Come to the cushion, sit down, train your mind. How do you train your mind? Sit down, hold still, watch what moves. And by watching what moves without grasping it, passion, without rejecting it, aggression, and without shutting down or distracting yourself from it to going into another thing, the awareness itself becomes more and more and more primary slowly. It's a relative part of the spiritual path. And eventually the awareness starts to leak out in front of the thinking process, and we start to lead our life with our awareness rather than with our paranoid mind. Drop down out of the paranoia, rise up out of the hope and fear. This is where you need to live. And this isn't even a place. It's just an idea. More? What did I just say? Not too bad. Do that 100,000 times. Yes.
So you say it's all about awareness.
Yes.
So if we have a negative emotion that arises and we manage to just look at it, is there an expectation that it will dissolve?
Well, there could be an expectation of that, but that's always extra. Emotion is one thing. The expectation is the whatever you call those things, those little fish that stick onto the side of sperm whales, pilot fish. It's like that. So the sperm whale is fine by itself, but then our pilot fish get stuck on them, and then we have all these additions. Little tiny heartbeats everywhere. More?
I'm just thinking about emotions that seem to, particularly negative ones, that have a tendency to kind of haunt.
Yeah.
And repeat over and over again. So are you saying that if there's enough awareness about that emotion may subside?
So here's the way I would respond to it. It may. I'm not saying it won't. That could happen. That emotion may never come up. But what's more than likely to happen is through awareness. Eventually you see whatever's arising, that there's no solid being experiencing that who you thought was somebody, me and my emotions, me and my feelings, or how I'm feeling, that the I part of that is no longer has any no credibility. There's no. It's like an actor walks off a stage, and that you get off the stage and you sit in the audience and you see the act going, you see the play, and it's still emotional, but you're there and you're not there. So you're no longer concerned about. You notice that the emotions are there and they're arising, but you know they're unreal because there's no one having the emotion. The causes and conditions that arise out of conditioned arising will keep going depending on whatever is pushing on, pulling on, whatever. But you don't need to get rid of them. You don't need to get rid of ego, because even ego is unreal. You just need to see that see that it is not. It's just an accumulation of the skandhas: form, feeling, perception, concept, consciousness, and it is discontinuous identity. If it were continuous identity, then you wouldn't be much affected by anything, because you'd be here, but just that your whole identity can keep changing. You feel really good, and then you feel really bad, and then you're swayed by your emotions. So I say, you've heard me say many times, don't believe your thoughts. Don't disbelieve your thoughts. Don't do anything with them. Don't accept them. Don't reject them. I never say, well, just accept it. I don't say that. That's incorrect. As far as I'm concerned, someone else might teach that way, but I don't. Well, I guess I cleared all that up. Further comments, questions, explorations, transmutations? Yes.
You were referring to someone earlier about maybe somebody has an easy lifetime karmically, and maybe there's stuff under there, but they're having, on the surface, nice looking circumstances.
Yeah.
But do things need to come up or get triggered in order to work with karma?
A little bit. The important part of it seems to be seeing that, to use the Yogacara approach to the teachings, is there's no self. There's something, but it's not a solid being, and there's no other. There's something there, but it's not a solid kind of self that's happening. It's discontinuous. It's constantly morphing or transforming just out of causes and conditions. That's why the transformation, when you do that, is not something you're doing, it's something you are. You are the transformation. What is this called? What's the liberation? Or the word for that, liberation? It's freedom. It's not freedom from something, to do, away from something. It's not freedom to do something. Fundamental freedom.
Is revolution at the basis synonymous with freedom, the way you're talking about?
Revolution is the basis of consciousness, is the way the Yogacharans talk about liberation. They say that the Alaya Vijnana, the base consciousness, the storehouse consciousness, there needs to be a turning about there, because until there's a turning about, then that's kind of a hideout for the confusion. And it starts to get triggered and come tumbling down into our everyday situation, not been seen.
Will you describe turning about from what to what?
Well, I don't. Well, I guess if I did it the way you're asking, then I would say turning about from grasping to no grasping. Turning about from pushing to no pushing. To no. As I have sometimes said, even though you have some kind of choice coming up about this or that, should I do this or should I do that? Someone who is liberated, someone who understands deeply who they are and what this being a being is, they no longer make any choices, because everything is obvious what to do next. They don't look at things and try to strategize, because they're no longer interested in any gaining idea. They're not fundamentally, and I say that with emphasis on fundamentally, they're not fundamentally interested in even preserving their life, their physical life. I mean, I'm not saying they're going to walk in front of a truck, but that's kind of, somewhat, but it's not real strong. The fear of no longer being a biological organism anymore is because your understanding goes way beyond your biology. And it's not something you can give to someone, because you already have it. It's already the case. So, but you, not accusing anyone of anything, but you're probably covering it up with fear, covering it up with hope. That's the sneaky one, is hope, because that's one everybody uses. Well, you gotta have hope. No, you don't. You don't have to have hope. Whose voice was that? You don't really need hope. Hope is a waste of energy. You could just be here, be hopeless. It just means without hope. What's the big deal? Well, being hopeless also provides, the other end of that is you're fearless. No hope, no fear. fearless. In other words, you can't threaten who you are. If you're identified with a body, then somebody coming at you with a tire iron is going to be threatening. But that doesn't mean that if you've been through this transformation that you're going to stand there and take it. You might be so clear that you're able to take the tire iron away from them and scold them. Bad. Did not kill anybody. So, and one more thing, the way I talk about this sometimes is if you really see who this is, pointing to yourself, myself, you see who this is, then you're very clear about others, and you see when someone is upset and coming at you with anger, aggression, and everything. You not only see that, but you see deeply into their that they're covering up all kinds of fear and terror by being aggressive. That's how they do that. The aggression will cover up the very soft spot that they don't want anybody to know about. Anybody you see that's really a bully or something like that, they're terrified. And it might have been covering it up since they were 3 or 4. Yes.
So, should we be talking with physicians and telling them not to give their dying patients any hope, or their patients who have cancer?
No, mind your own business. Mind your own business. Don't interfere. Don't do anything without permission. Now, if the physician asks you.
No, if you're a physician,
yeah,
and the patient is dying.
Are you a physician?
I'm not, but I've been in the medical school for 25 years, so
okay.
So we teach the students to be compassionate, to be understanding, and not to take away hope from a person who's dying or sick or whatever.
I don't think you should take it away, but I wouldn't encourage it. Why do that? You should respect their karma. You should respect that person. Be with them and not take that away, because death is just the other life and death. When someone is dying, that's something that you could be with them. I'm not saying if they're terrified that you need to cover it over. Oh, everything's going to be okay. It's okay to die. Go right ahead. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying you could relate to them in their fear and work with that part of their consciousness so that they could have some understanding of what's happening. And you might say that hopefulness could arise out of a deep understanding, but hopefulness is always extra, and it's always the opposite of fear. When there's fear, then we cover it up. Or when there's terror, then we go to the extreme, and we puff ourselves up and try to, be bullies or be, self-centered people. More. So when I say mind your own business, I'm saying allow people to be who they are. Everybody. Don't meddle with anybody. We've been around for millennia, and we're going to be around. Maybe not on this planet. We might blow this one up, but there's lots of planets. There's lots of dimensions. How do I know? I don't know. That's how I know. It's not a knowing kind of knowing. It's a knowing kind of knowing. Further questions? Further answers? Very good. Thank you.
We'll dedicate the merit.
Yes.